discussing ontological oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, professor of English and philosophy. Although many times our conversations on the show stray into areas that may be a bit dark or unsettling, rarely do we address these issues topically. Just as normal subjects have negative qualities, what seems to be an inherently negative topic can also have exciting and thought-provoking characteristics. So today, we ask you to stay tuned in as we discuss cynicism. Cynicism, I can't help but think about the conversation we were just having before we started recording. Me and my wife went on vacation, and we didn't have anything planned. And so the whole thing was pretty serendipitous. We had a great time. It was chock full of these fantastic experiences that just sort of happened, naturally off the cuff. And so I don't think that you can have that sort of experience if you're a cynical person. I think that starting with that mindset already puts you in a spot where you're just sort of, closed to having some of those good experiences happen. But that is itself a shading that our present culture has brought to the word. Cynicism too. But we'll get to that. Yeah, it has a really interesting history. So we'll first ask the question, which is a little bit complex. What is cynicism?
Well, the very name in the ism is sort of misleading because there was never a formal school, so to speak, of cynics. And the name cynic and cynicism derives from words that essentially refer to dog. So there was a building that, and I always mispronounce the thing, but it's essentially a cynosarges. It was a structure in which people called the nothai or nothoi would study and work and work out. Essentially a gymnasium. Excuse me. But it was for people who were not citizens, who were essentially what we call the poorhouse. The people who were marginalized. And so in one sense, this is a philosophy arising out of the people who aren't going to the more formal places, and there are other buildings that have been associated with different philosophies and isms. But it's a little more haphazard than that, and it crosses 600 years when it was really flourishing, and up and down even during that time, from about 200 years BC to 400, and it has a commonality, which is to try to reach back to what was said, being natural rather than be embracing the artificial things that a culture thrusts upon you, the desire for wealth or certain customs or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, I think that at this point, there's probably a few listeners that are surprised to find out that cynicism was an actual philosophy, right? There was Greek cynics. So, yeah, and I think that you covered it pretty well generally. And what's sort of interesting about it is if you look at the cynical philosophy in broad strokes, it doesn't really allude to our current conception of the word very much. A lot of it is, hey, you should live your life in service to virtue, right? And you should kind of strip away notions of fame or wealth or things that get in the way of living a virtuous life. And, you should work on exercising your body and mind and stuff in order to
and that all sounds good.
Right.
Until you get to the root of it, and the shortcut to virtue. Because cynics presented themselves as a shortcut. I mean, there are these things about it that, even though Plato had some appreciation for the first cynic was one of the first formal cynic, Antisthenes, and Plato thought highly of his student. Now, he's not as thought highly of him probably as Aristotle, but but there were a lot of students.
Oh, yeah.
and so, you have Antisthenes and then Diogenes and then Crates. So we've got another triumvirate that sort of splits off into its own sequel. And what they're talking about is living aesthetically, sparely, and eventually out of cynicism, Stoicism partially developed Stoicism on its own, but there's a linkage. So Diogenes was known that the dog thing comes in, Diogenes of Sinope is the dog because he lived in a giant jar or olive oil kind of jar.
The Greek version of a refrigerator box.
Yeah, exactly. And he would accost people on the street. So it wasn't about removing yourself into some kind of hermitage. It was constantly challenging people about what was going on in the culture at the time.
Yeah. And that's where it's interesting is because in the broad strokes that I described at the beginning, it sounds pretty good. But then some things stuck out to me. And the one thing that really stuck out to me when reading about it is, one of their values was to live naturally, right? To live, as you would naturally. And, in some ways that means, okay, they're living on the street or they're in the middle of winter, they might walk barefoot or, just wear a thin cloak or these sorts of things. And that's, they speculate that's part of where that dog nickname came from as well, is that people say they lived like dogs. They lived outside. They'd sleep on the ground. They do these things.
They challenge people. They would not be, there were not ascribed manners to this.
Right. Yeah. And that's where, the thing that I read that sort of stuck out to me was they said, when the cynics said that they were going to live naturally, they didn't mean they were going to work for their labor. they were gonna live in the cities and beg from people, and then be a constant mirror that was held up to society about the evils of the at that time modern world. And so that's kind of that's sort of an overview of the cynical philosophy. And that's sort of where the modern term is keyed from, is when we talk about being cynical now, we're not talking about attempting to live a virtuous life and giving little value to wealth and fame and these sorts of things. We're usually talking about somebody who is aggressively berating society and having a sort of skeptical view of modern life.
And skepticism and cynicism are often associated as the same, but they're not.
And that was my very next question. What separates cynicism and skepticism?
First, a degree of roughness, I think. Diogenes, for instance. Now, we don't have any writings of these people. So once again, and we've talked about this with a lot of different folks, we have what people said they said, which is sometimes as close as you can get to the history. But Diogenes is said to have said things such as, in a rich man's house, there is no place to spit but his face. I'm a citizen of the world. That phrase came from way back.
Yeah, they said that they thought the cynics were like the first cosmopolitans in some way.
And the foundation of every state is the education of its youth. But what they meant by education is certainly up for grabs. So skepticism is to say, I'm going to consider and poke at and not accept as a first principle something that somebody else is asserting until I research it, test it, try it. And we have a lot of people using the word skeptics. I'm a skeptic about this or that today when they don't mean that, because they're not researching, testing, or trying. They're just retreating and saying, nope, I know what the truth is. You can't tell me. That's not skepticism.
Right.
It's also not cynicism in the sense of challenging positions and structures. There would be some who would say, well, look at all these this mule movie thing and everything we're going to challenge every vote. That's not being cynic in a philosophical way. That's just asserting what you already want to know without actually looking at how things are.
Yeah, and and that's really interesting, right? Is thinking about this historical notion of cynicism, because, like you said, if they didn't write anything down, we're at the mercy of the people who are chronicling their philosophy to give us information on them. And so when you look at the broad strokes of cynicism, and then you look at what people wrote about them, it seems that the lifestyle of a cynic versus the values or beliefs of a cynic would not really match up. And it makes you wonder if maybe the people who were writing the accounts of cynics were just rubbed the wrong way to such an extent that they might have exaggerated some of the qualities of them.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's unavoidable, and it's good that you brought that up because, well, one of the most well-known troubles, according to the stories that Diogenes got into, a pretty serious trouble was with Alexander the Great.
I didn't read this.
So Alexander the Great, he found, the story goes, he found Diogenes looking at a pile of human bones after a battle. And Diogenes says, I am searching for the bones of your father, but I can't distinguish them from those of a slave. That didn't go over apparently too well. Apparently lived, but even so, but when you think about that, it's essentially saying you're no different than any other human being in the basic parts of your being itself. Alexander, here's a slave, here's your father. Which one? They're bones. Can you tell which bones? And there's a wisdom in that. But then there's also the snarkiness.
Yeah.
And the sassiness of talking back to power. And I think a lot of people now think they're being cynical by challenging anything that they don't want to believe about the government. But that's not what Diogenes was doing. Diogenes was taking something specific and saying, let's question this. He was following a kind of really coarse Socratic method.
Yeah. And like you said, there's more of an edge to it, right? Because like you said, skepticism is values neutral by definition, right? If you're a skeptic, you're not taking anything at face value. You're not starting with some presuppositions. You're saying, okay, let me look at this and then sort of suss out what the truth of the matter is. Cynics are starting with a values-laden position, saying that virtue, right, is what's right, and that things like wealth and fame and status and these other things get in the way. And so then, with the built-in kind of aggression, right? You've been named after dogs, you're doing these things, kind of embracing that archetype. Then it leads you to challenge these people who do have wealth and fame and power. And I could see it becoming quite a combustible arrangement, especially, I mean, if you know anything about Alexander the Great and his father, Philip the Master, it's probably not the guy you wanted to insult about his father. But like you said, there is a wisdom there, right? That is separate from skepticism, and it is separate from, other philosophies in the way that it is presented.
And let's think about, as you said, the refrigerator box. So how many of us have been approached by somebody who's a street person? I think many of us have. It's uncomfortable in the moment. One's whole privilege is being put to question. not necessarily by the person directly, but even by the fact of, can you give me $1? Well, no, I can't. You know, and of course you could.
Right.
But then you're doing the mental math. But what would you do with that $1, sir? But do we do that mental math on ourselves often? And so I can see it being, we have Diogenes as on our own streets. People who are, not all people are homeless are mentally ill. Not all people are homeless or have all kinds of medical issues, except what maybe they just happen to fall through the crack. There are a lot of people out on the street who 10 weeks ago, 5 years ago, were pretty major players in their own areas. Okay. So, or ordinary people who worked and then the safety net didn't work. And if we think about, but we don't often stop and think about that. We just separate ourselves. So to me, that's going to be an odd equation. Listen, don't give up on me. There is a kind of great teacher, Christ-like flavor in some of the Diogenes stories. Not equating, just saying, who was the radical who was constantly upsetting people and getting under their skin? And in the sacred text and the stories of, Buddha had been well-to-do, but he had questioned a whole lot of people. Lots of leaders.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. As Buddha essentially lived an ascetic lifestyle. He lived under a tree. And was like you said, I'm Jesus. Hey, give away all your stuff. Come follow me.
Yes.
And these sorts of things. So that is a common trope across religious or philosophical leaders, and even in less severe philosophies, you still see that element of de-emphasizing materialism. Maybe not to the extent of asceticism, but this idea that an accumulation of things are really just going to get in your way when it comes to your psychological, spiritual life.
Yes. Why are you accumulating, you, us, any of us? I mean, I implicate myself entirely in this. When I say you, I should say why we. Why did, when we are willing to look at why we might be purchasing something, and we ask ourselves why, and then we find it okay to do so, or we've gone through that, then we're doing something that I think the cynics, perhaps at their best, and I'm always cautious about this because again, it's not a formal school. There weren't rules and regulations and so on. Just one dogma. But one of the other things that Diogenes is said to have said is, of what use is a philosopher who doesn't hurt anybody's feelings? Now I think when you read the dialogues, Plato's dialogues starring Socrates, then you find some feelings that could be damaged or bruised or wounded young people. No, I'm right. Or no, I didn't mean that. Or, I think that philosophy necessarily upsets the apple cart.
Yeah.
But Diogenes was willing to say, apparently, hey, you're going to get your feelings hurt.
Yeah. So we've talked about, what separates cynicism from skepticism. And now we're sort of transitioning into our modern use of cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
When did that change occur? When did we stop thinking about cynicism as a philosophical sort of school and really just distill it down into this sort of negative word?
I think it's traceable to, I think linguists would make it traceable to the post-industrial revolution time up till now, but maybe even more so to the Great Depression, when when a whole system seems to be falling apart, and everything that people thought they believed in isn't necessarily what they thought they believed in. There's a fragility and a vulnerability, and that's an opening for the more negative.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing to say, because when you think about it, I think pretty much any time there's a sea change in a culture, that's going to bring out some cynicism. And you can even argue that good changes are going to do that, because what is a good change for one segment of the population is going to be a bad change for another segment, right? In the Industrial Revolution, right? The sort of artisan makers, they probably didn't think that this automation and machinery was, these cheaper mass-produced goods were a good thing, right?
No, and that's why you had the people, the story, which there is some truth to this, of people throwing wooden shoes into machinery to protest. And no, they weren't happy about it.
And that's what makes you question, your life, each part of it. Because we've talked about it in the past, how I forget if it was Socrates or Plato. One of them sort of railed against writing because he thought that technology was going to ruin people's
Interestingly,
memories.
It was Plato.
Plato, yeah. So Plato thought that writing was going to ruin people's memories. Then you have people who thought the radio was bad, thought the TV was bad, right, thought that computers and cell phones are bad. And the fact of the matter is that you can't outright reject some of the things that these people are saying, right? No. And so again, with any sea change, I think that there is good and bad. Sometimes for certain segments of the population may benefit or be damaged by it more. But I think in some ways, every person that's part of a huge shift, whether it be technological or political or whatever, everybody feels that effect of either positive or negative influence, and sometimes a little bit of both. But.
Yeah. Sure.
So what separates cynicism from pessimism in our modern sense?
That's a really good question. Another ism. We generally work with a definition of pessimism as having always a gloomy, dark view of things. And we associate negativity to that. The connotation is, well, you're such a pessimist. Well, and people who are pessimists, well, this is you and I were communicating this week. It turns out from a very, very, very large medical study that is longitudinal, which means it's gone on for years. It turns out that expressions of righteous anger, now that's the word righteous has some expressions of contempt, depending on what is the source of causing the rise of that, to vent those things, and vent by so-called venting, express them and not being suppressing them within yourself. It appears that there is some indication that people who are older, who get angry about things and express contempt and express pessimism, are actually healthier, have, in the sense of, seem to have significantly fewer heart attacks than people who are always, well, sort of doing the Monty Python, the Life of Brian, one of my favorite movies. And I know this is going to just be sacrilegious to some, but Jesus is on the cross, and he starts singing, "Always look on the bright side of life." Now, put that aside for a minute, but think about how many times a day do people get, especially women, smile? Why aren't you smiling? How come, when you start to hear the quintessential Joker in the Batman trilogy with Heath Ledger, it's like, why so serious? We have this really ill relationship, one could argue, with medical studies, of always needing to try to be happy. And this has invaded work culture. This has invaded corporate culture, such that collegiate institutions where there are workshops ongoing where people you have to present a happy face. Everyone there, we cannot have any unhappy employees. Well, that's very Orwellian. So I've skidded off with this, but to pull it back, pessimism means having more often than not a dim view of how people are or how a system is. Skepticism really has two large meanings that we seem to use in this culture, and one is to be always needing to question, and we've talked about that, and the other is to assume that anything that someone else says is arising out of self-interest.
Yeah,
that's where it crosses sort of to cynicism.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's really interesting. So on the vacation we just took, I'm going to send you this podcast when we're done. And anybody else who wants to look it up, I don't remember the name of the lady, but I know the podcast. It's one of my favorites. Is Hidden Brain.
Oh yes, Shankar Vedantam.
Yeah.
He's an amazing psychologist.
Yeah. So he did an interview with a Dutch woman who this is her area of specialty is looking at language and how emotions translate. And she found similar results. I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of her studies that you're talking about. I didn't have a chance to look it up before we did the show, but she did a study and found that Americans do benefit from expressing these negative feelings in their physical health. But what she found is that is culturally unique. And so when you looked at Japanese people actually benefited from what we Americans call bottling up negative emotions. But in Japan, it's not looked at that way. And this is where language has a huge impact, right?
Yes.
In America, if you say, oh, you're bottling up your emotion, that sounds like you're doing something negative. Whereas in Japanese culture, she stumbled upon this because one of the ways she had worded one of her questionnaires, she was frustrated because the Japanese people said this question doesn't make sense to us. I think it was how deeply or strongly do you feel X emotion? And they said, well, this doesn't make sense to us because of the language. What they found is that Japanese people actually take a sort of pride and satisfaction in internalizing these negative emotions and then not reacting to them. And that's built into their culture. And then she went into sort of anecdotal account of how even a Western European society like hers, her being Dutch, she said when she came to the U.S., she committed a few faux pas that had to do with how language and emotions translate across culture. She said in Dutch culture, it's a compliment to tell somebody that they look tired because it means that they've been working hard. So she said, she came over and she was invited to this conference that was being put on by this colleague that she really admired. And she ran into her in the bathroom and she said, wow, you look really tired. This must be a lot of work. And the other woman, was really embarrassed and tried to fix her makeup and do all this stuff, right?
Yeah. This is interesting.
And so, and another one that she said was that in Dutch culture, they don't say the word thank you to people close to them. So she said, if somebody does you a favor or somebody comes over to eat or does those sorts of things, if it's sort of a formal or a relationship or they're an acquaintance, you thank them if they do something. But if it's a close friend, you don't say thank you. And she said her husband, who's American, when they first started going out, he'd bring her coffee and she'd just nod and he'd say, well, would it kill you to say thank you? And to her, that was an insult, because if she were to say thank you, that would mean that they had a much more distant
relationship.
Right.
Yeah,
much more distant relationship than they had. So again, our philosophical themes combine here, talking about emotion, talking about language. And when we think about cynicism or pessimism or skepticism, and how we define these categories, there's a big cultural element as well that plays into these, and so coming up with these definitions is a little bit tricky.
It is, and this is a wonderful trip you just took us through, back to our root, which is always language. It's really interesting to me that there was this piece that I read this week about current American pop culture in science fiction and fantasy genres, and not just American, British as well, that it seems to be focused always on the dark, things falling apart, and so on. And the person who was writing this article is saying that this is where we're in trouble, because we're telling stories of darkness and things falling apart, and we owe it to ourselves to tell ourselves stories where we solve things and where things are bright again. And I have really mixed feelings about that, not just because of that, that medical study, which is one thing, and it may well have been associated with that woman you're talking about. Because stories, if they're honest and they're compelling, are going to be telling us about what we're feeling. And if we're feeling that things are falling apart, it's not wrong to have stories telling us about how we respond when things fall apart. It's because that article was seemingly making an assumption, rather like some people make about Aesop, that the story that I tell is going to have this moral and this is what you should get from it, rather than it's reflective of culture.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was another example that she gave. She was talking about her kids being in American school and her mother meeting her kid's teacher. And, the teacher, you can imagine an elementary school teacher. Her mother walked away from the interaction very insulted, sort of, because she thought of this elementary school teacher as being disingenuous. Oh, your kid is so smart and he does all these things and whatnot. And she said, well, in Dutch culture, like if you respect somebody and you have a close relationship with them, you're always honest. You always tell them exactly the way things are. Hey, I don't like this, or, this thing that you did was so, or whatever.
Yeah.
And they said, in America, everything's always good. Everything is always, and I think that that's reflected in what you were saying. And I think that the challenge to the American people, right? We have this sort of strange bipolar identity going on, right? Where we have this intense cynicism towards political institutions and other aspects of society. But then in sort of our interpersonal interactions, we hold this high standard of, facing everything with a smile and presenting everything in the brightest light and all these sorts of things. And it's almost schizophrenic in a way, right? Where it's how can you do that? How can you both be so focused on happiness, which we've talked about before, is not a solid state.
It's not sustainable.
Right.
It doesn't make you terrible if you have moments of pessimism. If you're always living in pessimism and it's affecting your mental health, that I have to hasten to say, I'm not making light of that, of course, because any expectation of any one steady state, as you just said, is not a balance for a person, I think, and we recognize that, but we to just associate all kinds of negativity. And it's really interesting if you look at it, because there are people of every political ilk, and I'm not being relativistic about this, who could claim to be righteous cynics.
Yeah.
And you can, if you just insert statements that you hear in the rhetoric, You might say, oh, well, yeah, they're challenging culture. They're challenging society the way it is. But it's really for what purpose? And the cynic's purpose was not to get back to some kind of ideal that never existed. It was to make oneself better.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's other interesting studies that go along with that back up what you're saying. Looking at news cycles, right? They found that, subjecting people to essentially gamesmanship news cycles, which is the predominant news that you receive now, increases cynicism in people. Whereas if you give people dry, facts-based news, it does not do that. So, and then what happens is you create this sort of vicious feedback loop, right? So you present gamesmanship news, whether you're on the right or the left or whatever. This causes people to be cynical about other people. And here's where the difference between cynicism and pessimism is important. Is pessimism is a negative outlook on outcomes. So if you're pessimistic, you're thinking that something is probably going to turn out bad. If you're a cynic, you have a negative outlook on people's motivations.
Yeah.
So if you're presented with negative news, you take on a cynical outlook. So you have a negative view of the other side's motivations. And then what happens is the more cynical you are, that creates cynicism in people on the other side. And you have this self-perpetuating cycle that drives things further and further apart.
Yeah.
So it's sort of sad in a way that if you look at these media companies, right, these news agencies that present these far left or far right viewpoints, undoubtedly their motivation is, first off, their ideals think that the way to fix the country is to be a certain way. And so they try to do that by persuading people to their side. But what they don't see is that in doing that, in using the language and in using the things that they do to convince people to join their side, they're imbuing them with a cynical attitude that causes them to divide America even further apart than fix any problems.
You are such an idealist. So when I'm realizing I still have clingy elements of that within me, but when you just said what you said, and you said, well, the first thing that these media companies are thinking about, and it was such an ideal view, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's dollar signs. They're thinking about how can I, but so it's good. It's good for me to hear you say that, because we can go down this trope from Alice in Wonderland that I never thought would become a trope, going down the rabbit hole. Well, people don't follow what the logical extension of that metaphor. Because again, people don't talk about metaphors nearly as much as you would like. To go down the rabbit hole, which is what Alice did, was to become totally perplexed by and disconnected from anything but nonsense. And that still works. But Alice emerges having thought a whole lot about words and what they mean and what nonsense can do to you when she comes back to the world. It's not a didactic tale, but when you go down a rabbit hole, you usually can emerge with some pretty important things.
Yeah. And I think that it is funny. I think that so the cynicism, and I just gave the example with the media companies. And so you and I, we might disagree there on their motivations at the top, right? And those attitudes probably come from different interactions that we've had throughout our lives, right? And I find that with myself a lot, which is that, there's a lot of people that I disagree with, a lot of positions that I disagree with. But I think at the core, I always like to believe that people really want the best outcomes for themselves and in a utilitarian way as many other people as possible, right? And usually I'm rewarded for that belief. And so it perpetuates this this anti-cynicism.
Well,
but other people are not, right? Depending on other circumstances, like we said, the news cycle is one moderate part of everybody's life, everybody's interactions, everybody's views.
Yeah.
But their interpersonal interactions with others, all interactions with anybody else, can determine how cynical or how trusting somebody might be in human nature itself.
This is why I so valued being a teacher. And those moments still emerge, because I wouldn't want to be talking into this thing, this microphone, and think somebody is saying, "Oh, well, he's celebrating an absolute cynicism." No, I'm not. If I did, then I would have growled at you about saying that about me, but I'm not saying, that it's good that someone has that. That sort of pulls one back. And that's what a conversation is for, is to sometimes throw out a lifeline, sometimes say, there's a little undertow down there.
Yeah.
But I also, part of my training in English and literature was in finding the joy of writers like Oscar Wilde, who, the time period I was talking about when cynicism was, I think, canting a different direction. An amazing writer of stories and fables and plays and haunted and hunted because of his own gender, sexuality. But he says, what is a cynic? A man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And that takes us more to that capitalistic notion of, I know how much that thing cost you, and I wouldn't spend money on that. Without saying, yes, but if none of us is spending money on anything, what kind of culture would we have? Maybe it'd be a fine culture, but it's that questioning doesn't seem to happen.
Yeah, I see us doing another episode related to time at some point, because I think that much like space-time is a single continuous property, I feel like time money is also a single continuous property, right? Because in modern society, most of us work for money. And so as a result, the two are intimately connected. And on top of that, it's relativistic, right? Because we don't all make the same amount of money. We all don't work the same amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like you said, finding the price of things, the price is an objective thing. It's your type 1 supernovas, right? They're your markers that give you the objective where you are in space with money and time. But we all see that price tag subjectively because we make different amounts of money. We spend different amounts of time to earn that money. The value of that thing is going to have a different value to each person based upon what they're...
About the whole cluster of who they are.
Yeah.
A piece of meteorite? You bet. Somebody else might say, "Could I buy that?" You betcha. Why are you buying a piece of rock?
Yeah.
How do you even know that's from space? Now, you tell me, skepticism, cynicism, pessimism, because somebody would say this. Are you kidding me? You bought this piece of rock and they told you it was from outer space? How do you know that?
Right.
So what is there?
So yeah, there's several different ways. So I mean, I bought a piece of meteorite on my last vacation just to fill in the blanks. But yeah, so there's a couple things. One was they have a certificate of authenticity from the International Aeronautics Union with it. The other part of it is that asteroids and meteorites have very specific looks to them because of the environment they're formed in.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of times you can look at these rocks and just tell that they're out of this world just by the appearance of them. Because there's usually the environment they're formed in is in space. So the gravity is much lower. The metallic composition is different because whereas on Earth you have a lot of nickel and iron in the core and those sorts of things, in space you have a lot of other metallic.
So
elements.
the authority of science and the aesthetic impression that it leaves, and I wasn't trying to push it to someplace you didn't want to talk about. I just think it's because we are in a culture now that is trying to. So much of our culture, not entirely, of course, is trying to devalue any notion of authority. We've talked about that before, and trying to devalue a notion of aesthetics. And when you take these elements of philosophy away, you also remove any foundational source. And so that then a very strange kind of skepticism or worse, cynicism can emerge.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a really good example. I'm glad you brought it up because it does. It sort of, in a nutshell, encapsulates what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So approaching a meteorite purchase with a cynical attitude, right, would be questioning the motivations of the seller. Okay, why are they selling me a meteorite? What are they looking for here? That's not necessarily a bad attitude to have. A skeptical attitude is probably a better attitude to have, which is what you just brought up. Well, how do I know this is from space? How do I know this is authentic? That sort of thing. But I think that it's important to again, put the definition of the two in because, like you said, in modern terms, a lot of people are talking about cynicism when in reality, they're just talking about outright denial based off of their internal value system rather than facts or,
yes.
authoritative
yes.
Findings. So that's the important part and I think that now we're getting to that sort of the crux of the issue that applies to modern listeners, right?
Yep.
Is this idea of cynicism versus, what would you even call that? Just outright denial.
I think denial is the right word. Yeah. Denialism, which we are in spades dealing with right now. It's of the essence of the place that we live. I know we have places internationally that we have people in different countries that I'm humbled and delighted that people in different places are listening to us. And I don't know enough about any particular place on earth, but we all know, we seem to think we know about our own home base best. And if you care about your home base, then not to say something, not to slam and blast, but to say something that to urge. It's not preservation. That's not quite the right word. There are things that we don't need to preserve, but to urge its continued development. So there, I give you some idealism.
Yeah.
Because I still believe in that. I still think we either try to make things better, or we throw up our hands and say we can't do anything, which is, or we embrace not being able to do anything, and I'm just going to live entirely for myself, can't care about anybody else. I think many of us go through the spectrum of saying various things like that in any given day. So I'm certainly guilty. But I think if we look at it really hard and we say, do we really believe in something still? Do we? Then there's the cynical part of us that says, if we believe in something, we need to question. That, for me, is where the cynical part is good. There's times when you can sit and have a nice Socratic dialogue. We seem very much not interested in that in our culture, to me. Well, what's next? Growling at people and saying, you know what? If you're rich and you have a wonderful place, there's obviously in your nice fancy place, there's no place to spit except in your face. Now, I would never say that to somebody. If Diogenes said it, well, he's got more cojones than I do. But the value is in saying anything can be said if it needs to be said in order to make someplace better.
Yeah, I think that, going back to our example of cynicism with the news cycle, right? and again, we talk about cynicism in a pejorative way, and this gamesmanship news cycle increasing cynicism. But if you think about cynicism as the questioning of people's motives, and you think, well, if you look at the gamesmanship news cycle, rather than it causing you to question the motives of the person on the other side of the aisle from you, if it caused you instead to question the motives of the media company presenting the news cycle, then you would have a constructive cynicism.
Yeah.
And much like Diogenes said, right, you're not going to have cynicism without somebody getting their feelings hurt. And that's an essential element of questioning somebody's motives. Right?
Now, if your primary purpose, and this is what I hasten because I realized I'm listening to my head of what I just said a couple moments ago. If your primary purpose is to hurt somebody's feelings, then you're not accomplishing anything. If your purpose is to say things that may feel harsh, but ultimately lead to more questions that then say, well, so what can we rebuild here? Then I think there's something to it. There was somebody the other. Well, I'll just keep this completely as neutral, vague as I can, because I think the more universal model might work. A person who serves in government has a spouse who is hurt, who is attacked. Let's say, what if? And that person was attacked, is seriously hurt. And somebody who works with the person who's in government, whose spouse has been hurt, says, we think, we send, we're very sorry that this happened, but we very much hope that you're going to have to go home and spend the rest of your time taking care of that person. There's no way you can construe a statement like that as being a one of empathy or kindness. It's a thinly veiled, we really want you out of here. Now, if a cynic said that, if Diogenes had said that, I think it probably would have been an attempt to start a verbal fight to question where emotions are and what are the structures that a society says it values. And so if a pessimist heard that and said, well, yeah, of course, because that's how people are. They just ultimately thinking about themselves, or a skeptic, So I think any ordinary thing that happens, we have the capacity, if we let ourselves, put any number of different philosophical models, take that condition, that situation, that example, and say, what does that teach us about who we are?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, so that's what it comes down to, is like I promised in the intro, we were going to talk about cynicism and really bring out some of the fascinating and thought-provoking things about it. And, I think that it's been a good episode because we've informed listeners about the philosophical sort of, not school, but, thought behind cynicism that they might not have been aware of, and behind some of the constructive ways it can be applied. So until next time, keep on.